Could the Iran war lead to Trump's removal, JD Vance's biggest opportunity yet? A question is now being asked in Washington that nobody expected to be asking this soon. Could the Iran war be the thing that ends Donald Trump's presidency? And right behind that question, quieter but just as significant, comes another one. Is JD Vance ready for what comes next if it does? These are not fringe questions being asked by political opponents in bad faith. They are being asked by serious people, strategists, constitutional scholars, former officials who have spent careers studying how power shifts at the highest levels of American government. And the fact that they're being asked at all tells you something important about where this moment sits in the larger arc of this administration. Because wars have a history of doing things to presidencies that nothing else can. They reveal character, they force decisions that can't be walked back. They create winners and losers, not just on the battlefield but in the political landscape at home. And a war with Iran, if it comes, would be no different. Let's start with the constitutional dimension, because that's where the most serious conversations are happening. The 25th Amendment, which was already in the public conversation after recent reports of tension between Trump and Vance, establishes a process for removing a president who is deemed unable to fulfill the duties of the office. A military conflict doesn't automatically trigger that process, but it creates conditions under which that process becomes more imaginable. If a war goes badly, if decisions are made that produce catastrophic consequences, if the president's judgment comes under serious question from people inside the cabinet who have direct visibility into what's happening, under those circumstances, the 25th Amendment stops being a theoretical provision and starts being a live option that real people with real power are evaluating. And the person at the center of that evaluation, constitutionally and practically, is the Vice President, JD Vance. Now let's be precise. None of this means that the 25th Amendment will be invoked. It means the conditions exist under which the conversation becomes real, in a way it previously wasn't. And that distinction matters, because political reality is shaped not just by what happens, but by what becomes thinkable. 6 months ago, the idea of a serious 25th Amendment conversation in this administration was not thinkable. Today it is. That shift happened for reasons that the Iran situation is accelerating, not creating from scratch. So what specifically about the Iran war scenario makes this more real? Several things. First, a war with Iran would be extraordinarily costly and extraordinarily unpredictable. Military planners who have studied this scenario extensively describe it as one of the most complex potential conflicts the United States could engage in. Iran is not Iraq in 2003. It has sophisticated air defenses, significant missile capabilities, the ability to close the Strait of Hormuz, proxy forces across the region that can open multiple fronts simultaneously. A conflict that starts with a targeted military operation could escalate in ways that are very difficult to control. And when military situations escalate beyond what was planned, the political fallout at home escalates with them. Second, the economic consequences of an Iran war would be felt immediately and severely by ordinary Americans. Gas prices, inflation, supply chain disruptions, the kind of economic pain that translates directly into political anger. And political anger sustained and intensifying creates pressure on everyone in the chain of command, including the president, including the cabinet members who would be the ones evaluating the 25th Amendment question if it came to that. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the decision to go to war with Iran would be made by a relatively small number of people at the top of the American government. If that decision turns out to be wrong, the accountability will be concentrated in the same small number of people. That's a very different political dynamic than a crisis that developed gradually, with many decision points spread across many actors. This would be a decision made by specific people with specific consequences. And in American political history, consequential decisions that go badly tend to produce consequential political outcomes. Now let's talk about JD Vance specifically, because his position in this scenario is genuinely unique. Vance has built his political identity around a skepticism of foreign military adventures. His roots in the populist, America First tradition are explicitly opposed to the kind of interventionist foreign policy that a major war in the Middle East would represent. He has said so, repeatedly, in terms that were clear and on the record. That creates an interesting dynamic if the administration moves toward military action against Iran. Does Vance support it publicly and risk contradicting the core of his political identity? Does he distance himself privately while maintaining public loyalty? Or does he find a way to register his reservations in a manner that is visible enough to matter without being direct enough to constitute open defiance? Each of those choices has significant implications. Supporting the war publicly aligns him with a decision that could go very badly. And if it does, he shares the political consequences, distancing himself privately while maintaining public loyalty is the classic vice presidential maneuver. It preserves the relationship without fully committing him to the outcome. But registering visible reservations, even carefully, is a different kind of move entirely. It creates a record. It establishes a position. It sets up a narrative in which Vance was the voice of caution inside the administration. And if the war goes badly, that narrative becomes enormously valuable. Not just politically, but constitutionally. Because a vice president who can credibly claim to have argued against a disastrous decision is in a very different position when 25th Amendment conversations begin than one who was enthusiastically on board from the start. This is the calculation that political watchers believe Vance is currently making, not necessarily consciously or cynically, but the logic of his situation points in a specific direction, and the direction it points is toward careful, calibrated differentiation from the Iran war decision without open opposition to it. That's a very difficult position to maintain. It requires precision. It requires discipline. It requires the ability to signal without stating, to position without committing. JD Vance has demonstrated that he is capable of exactly that kind of political precision. Which is why people who are watching this closely believe he understands what this moment represents. Let's talk about the opportunity itself. Because describing this as an opportunity for Vance requires acknowledging something that is uncomfortable to say directly. A bad outcome for the country can be a good outcome for an ambitious politician if that politician was positioned correctly before the bad outcome arrived. That's not a cynical observation. It's a historical fact. Every major political transition in American history has involved someone who benefited from a predecessor's failure. The question is always whether the beneficiary was complicit in the failure, whether they saw it coming and failed to prevent it when prevention was possible, whether their gain came at the country's expense in ways that should disqualify them from benefiting. Those are serious moral questions, and they don't have easy answers. What they have is consequences, political and historical consequences that follow politicians for the rest of their careers. The vice presidents who are remembered well are generally the ones who, when the moment came, acted in the interest of the country rather than purely in their own interest. Who took the harder path when both options were available? Whether JD Vance will be that kind of vice president, if this moment arrives, is a question nobody can answer in advance. What we can say is that the moment is taking shape around him, whether he is actively shaping it or not. The Iran war question is real. The 25th Amendment conversation is real. The gap between his stated political values and the direction the administration appears to be moving is real. And all of those real things are converging at the same time. Now let's consider the scenario where the war doesn't happen, where the Pakistan mediation works, where diplomacy finds a path, where the $200 billion war budget request becomes a bargaining chip rather than an actual expenditure. In that scenario, Vance's trip to Islamabad looks different in retrospect. It looks like the moment when the vice president played a key role in preventing a catastrophic conflict. That's also a significant political asset. In fact, it might be an even more powerful one, because a politician who helped prevent a war carries a different kind of credibility than one who simply survived a war that went badly. The prevent the war narrative is rarer, and rarer tends to be more valuable in the long run. So Vance's opportunity exists in both versions of this story. If the war happens and goes badly, his carefully maintained distance from the decision creates political space. If the war is prevented, his involvement in the diplomatic effort creates political credit, and it's a position that appears to have been constructed, whether deliberately or through circumstance, with real strategic intelligence. The question that remains is the hardest one. What does JD Vance actually want? Does he want to be president? Almost certainly. Does he want to get there through the failure of the man who made him vice president? Almost certainly not. Does he understand that the choice is being made right now? About Iran, about military spending, about diplomatic versus military paths will shape his own political future as much as they shape Trump's? He would have to be extraordinarily unaware not to. And JD Vance has never been unaware. That's the portrait of this moment. A vice president with deep convictions about foreign military intervention, watching his administration move toward exactly the kind of foreign military intervention his convictions oppose. A constitutional mechanism for leadership change sitting in the background, more real than it was 6 months ago. A diplomatic mission in Pakistan that he personally championed, creating a parallel narrative of prevention alongside the narrative of escalation. And a political opportunity that exists regardless of which way the situation breaks. This is one of the most consequential moments in JD Vance's political life. He knows it. Washington knows it. And now you know it too. What comes next will tell us more about who JD Vance really is than anything he has said or written or done up to this point. Because this is the moment where character gets revealed. Not in speeches, not in books, in decisions. made under pressure. With everything on the line, let's talk about the historical precedents. Because American history has seen this kind of moment before. And what happened in those moments is instructive. Lyndon Johnson became president because of an assassination. But the way he handled the transition, his steadiness, his immediate assumption of authority, his ability to project stability in an unstable moment, defined how history remembered him before Vietnam, complicated everything. Gerald Ford became president because of resignation. His decision to pardon Nixon cost him the next election. But the decision itself was made based on what he believed the country needed, not what was politically convenient. Bush served as vice president under Reagan and then won the presidency in his own right. His path was built on loyalty, competence, and the patient accumulation of credibility over years. Each of those transitions evolved a vice president who had been preparing, consciously or not, for a moment that most people around them thought would never come. The preparation that happens before the moment is what determines whether the person is ready when it arrives. JD Vance has been preparing, his trip to Pakistan, his carefully maintained public positions on military intervention, his cultivation of relationships across the diplomatic and national security establishment, his visible involvement in policy decisions that go beyond the typical vice presidential portfolio. All of that looks different now than it did 3 months ago. 3 months ago, it looked like the activity of an ambitious vice president building his profile. Today, it looks like the preparation of someone who understands that the ground beneath him is shifting. Whether that preparation was strategic from the beginning, or whether Vance is simply someone who works hard and covers his bases, and is now finding that his instincts have positioned him well by circumstance, is something only he knows. But the result is the same either way. He is positioned more carefully and more effectively than almost anyone in Washington currently appreciates. There's also a generational dimension to this story that deserves mention. JD Vance is 40 years old. The people around him in the highest levels of American government are mostly significantly older. The decisions being made about Iran, about military spending, about the long-term direction of American foreign policy, will have consequences that extend far beyond the political careers of the people making them. The generation that will live with those consequences most directly is Vance's generation, and the generation after his. That's not just a political point, it's a moral one. And it's a point that Vance, who built his political identity on advocating for people who have been left behind by the decisions of elites, is in a unique position to make, if he chooses to make it. If the moment comes, and it may be coming faster than anyone expected, the speech that JD Vance gives, the position he takes, the clarity with which he speaks about what the country needs versus what is politically convenient, will define him more completely than anything else in his career. More than the book, more than the Senate race, more than the vice presidency itself. Because those were all chapters in a story, this would be the moment the story turns. The Iran situation is moving fast. The constitutional conversation is alive. The opportunity is real, and JD Vance is standing at the center of all of it, watching, calculating, preparing, for a moment that may define not just his career, but the direction of the country itself. That's the story beneath the story. And it is moving faster than anyone expected.